Welcome back. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is promising to hold a vote on the Women's Health Protection Act. It's a bill that would codify Roe v. Wade, despite the incredibly slim odds. It passes a 50-50 Senate. This is on top of all the other legislative priorities the Senate is facing, passing the president's Ukraine aid request, securing more COVID funding, and passing a budget. Meanwhile, Federal Reserve is increasing interest rates as Americans and markets continue to worry about rising inflation and other pocketbook issues. So for more on this, I'm joined by Democratic Senator from Virginia, Tim Kaine. Senator, I want to start with, look, when you first got into politics, you were a self-described pro-life Democrat. But there was sort of this, what I would call, there was personally pro-life and maybe legally pro-choice. And I guess that probably would describe your position. Is that fair?
It is, Chuck. I think I'm about 30% of Americans have the same position I do. We're personally pro-life and we live that way, but we think people ought to be able to make their own reproductive decisions. And so it's a huge swath of the American public, even if it's not necessarily that much a represented position in Congress.
Yeah, is this, it feels like this is something that I see already. Susan Collins isn't going to vote for this version of the bill because there's some fine piece of fine print that she thinks is not protected there. Is this something that politically is even possible to get 51 people to agree on what the general, I mean, it feels like it seems impossible that you guys are going to agree on a floor.
Well, I think to get 60 votes right now in the Senate is virtually impossible, Chuck, because the Republicans want to overrule Roe versus Wade. There are a couple of exceptions, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, but most of them want to return to pre-Roe, where states get to decide if they want to criminalize women's reproductive health care decisions. So we can't get to 60. You might be able to see us get over 50 for some version of a clear statement that, Griswold, Roe, and Casey are good law, and Americans have a constitutional right to make their own reproductive health care decisions. So we're gonna make the effort to do that beginning next week.
I want to get to, so I want you to share your story in a few minutes about your fight with long COVID, but I want to ask quickly about the economy. I had a pretty high-level Democrat over the weekend say to me, I wish the White House had a inflation czar the way they have a COVID czar, and get out there and sort of acknowledge that, yes, we're dealing with inflation. This is not politically caused. This was, we got a lot of reasons for it, but here's what we're doing every day to work on it. And apparently this idea was shot down by the White House. What do you think of it?
Well, Chuck, it reminds me, I'm older than you, but I think it was Nixon or Ford that had the whip inflation now buttons, the win buttons that people would wear. And I can't remember if they had a czar, but they made it a front and center priority. I think that explains what the Fed is doing with interest rates. We have an economy that job growth is strong, wage growth is strong, GDP growth has been pretty robust, and I think it's going to continue to be, but we do have an inflation worry. There are things we can do in Congress. For example, if we were able to pass a reconciliation bill that would bring down child care and health care costs, we could really help people with two big pocketbook items. But I also think that what the Fed is doing under Jay Powell's leadership is trying to, without choking off the positive growth that we're seeing in jobs especially, can we narrow down and reduce the inflation challenge?
Tell me what it's like to live with long COVID. What's it like today?
Yeah, so it's like today. I mean, even as I'm talking to you, I got COVID when we were passing the CARES Act more than 2 years ago. And it was early, and I got hit with non-standard symptoms, but one of them was this, like a light switch went off, and all my nerves started to tingle. It's like I've got, my skin dipped in an Alka-Seltzer that's fizzing, and it never has gone away. So my other symptoms went away quick. This fizzing sensation, others are experiencing it. It's not painful. It doesn't stop me from working or exercising or sleeping, but it's just weird, and it's 24/7, and it's been going for 2 years. And at this point, I guess I kind of have to assume it's probably never going away.
What kind of, and I'm sure you're probably more aware of how many people have similar stories as yours. How many of you come across, and what kind of medical research has gone into this?
So Chuck, tons of people, as soon as I shared my story, my office has become a bit of a magnet for people who want to share theirs. And I decided to share my story after about 6 or 8 months. I'd been to a neurologist. I kind of felt like I understood what was going on, but I was running into others with much more serious symptoms who were not being believed. And when they were not being believed, I thought, well, if I am on the committee and I say, hey, look, I believe you because it's real, then that'll give them some comfort. But then I can also, on the committee, try to drive towards solutions. So here's what's going on. In the American Rescue Plan, we put more than $1 billion into research for causes and cures. And interestingly, Chuck, this one, we may know cures before we know causes. So for example, my nerve tingling thing, there are other cures for nerve tingling not related to COVID. Well, maybe those cures could work for people who have it connected to COVID. People with long COVID often have racing heart, irregular heart rates. Well, there's other cures for that. Would that work for somebody who got that because of COVID? So we're doing research, but the Long COVID Act that I put in recently is sort of 4 big pillars: gather patient data, more research into causes and cures, spread the information to providers, employers, and families, but then also let's provide support for those, for example, who might be so debilitated that they actually are disabled under Social Security, or they need an accommodation to be able to work. And so I'm very focused on this because I'm living with it and dealing with it, but there are many who are really suffering under it, and we owe them answers and we owe them treatments.
Look, you talked about getting medical professionals to believe their patient. You're almost describing what many times people who get Lyme disease go through, right? Their doctors are like, we can't find it, we can't find it.
Absolutely.
How do you make sure insurance companies don't deny benefits based on these symptoms that, again, are not as well known yet?
Well, Chuck, it's a really good question, and you're right. The research that we're going to do is going to answer some questions not just about long COVID, but about other conditions that may have followed viral infections, because Lyme disease and others often have a tail of neurological and other consequences. We want to research that too. But you're right, the coverage issues are fascinating. What if you got COVID at the start of COVID, before there was a lot of testing, and so you never really got a test, but you did have COVID? Then you've been vaccinated, so now you have antibodies in your system, but somebody could say, well, those antibodies, they're from your vaccination. They don't prove you had COVID. So making a claim for insurance, establishing a disability, asking an employer for an accommodation to help you work consistent with what you can do, these are all thorny questions, and that's what the 4th pillar of my bill would do: patient support to help folks who've been through this tough 2 years. We just passed 1 million deaths. I mean, my God, who would have ever believed that 2 years ago? But it's millions more that are going to be not dying of COVID, but having to live the rest of their lives with long COVID. And I think this bill, which does, I think, have some significant bipartisan support, particularly on the funding side, can help us provide some of that support.
Well, look, I've seen your interviews on this, and I felt as if the more people pay attention to this, I think you're right. People may have been shamed by doctors saying they're imagining things and things like that. You're not somebody that does this. This is happening to you. I appreciate you coming on and sharing your story, Senator.
Absolutely. Glad you, Chuck.
All right. Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat from Virginia.